Hello, my name is Colin and welcome to the Virtual DM. In this video, we are going to take a look at the Combat Groups extension created by Silent Ruin and distributed through Grim Press. Now, the Combat Groups extension allows you to preload encounters onto your combat tracker and choose whether or not the NPCs in those encounters are visible or not visible on the combat tracker. It also keeps all of your tokens visible on the map because your NPCs are technically on the combat tracker, although they're not yet visible. So this will be a lot easier to understand once we take a look at it. If after watching this video you decide you might like to pick up the Combat Groups extension, you will be able to find that at the Fantasy Grounds Forge. Just do a search for 5e Combat Groups, and I'll leave a link in the show notes for that. $10 is a killer deal for what I think is one of the very best extensions available in terms of helping a DM run better combat encounters. So let's get into seeing how this works. We'll begin by taking a look at how we would traditionally prep encounters for our gameplay. So I have my combat tracker open. I have a map here called Cave Lair, and I have a little story where I have 3 encounters that we want to prepare for the session. So I'll open up our first encounter here. We have the Cave Lair entrance where I have 2 orcs, Iceborne orc that I want to place. So I'm going to left click and drag those tokens onto the map where I want them to be during gameplay. They are both there visible, but they are only visible to me during my prep while this particular encounter is open. When I close the encounter, you will see that those tokens disappear off the map. And they are only going to reappear on the map when I add that particular encounter to our combat tracker. So if I reopen and I add it to our combat tracker, just close this out of the way. So they are both there. They're currently hidden. They're not showing. I'm going to have both of them show up, and we can see they are there now because they're on the combat tracker. They're visible on my map. This is one of the problems with prepping multiple encounters this way, and we'll take a look here. If I open up our second encounter, which is our warg, I'm going to add the warg onto our combat tracker. I'll close this out and just make some room for our warg. Now, we can already see we have 2 separate encounters that are now currently showing on the combat tracker. If I make our warg visible and bring him over, drop him into the cave, I can now currently see both of these tokens, and I have both encounters on my map. So you can see how very quickly things could get very complicated on the combat tracker. I would have to start using the hide NPC or show NPC functionality to keep some of the NPCs that I don't want my PCs to be able to see. Because if we go over to our player map, we can see all of these NPCs currently. So in order to hide the warg from when they're involved in this encounter, I would have to come up here and hide that NPC. I can still see that, but if I have 3, 4, 5 encounters, my combat tracker is going to get very cluttered, very difficult to manage very quickly. So Combat Groups allows us to put individual encounters onto our combat tracker but make the choice as to whether or not they are visible or not visible at any point during our gameplay. And so next we'll take a look at how you create combat groups. Now we're going to look at setting up, doing our preparation for these 3 encounters using the combat groups extension. So we'll start off here. We'll open up our first encounter. We have our 2 iceborne orcs that we want to place at the entrance of our map. What I'm going to do is add them directly to the combat tracker. I'm going to make, in this case, I'm going to make them both shown, and I left click and drag their tokens into place on the map. So there's a lot of similar stuff to the way we looked at our traditional prep, but this is the point where we bring in combat groups. So I come up here to the top where we have our select combat groups. Make sure that I'm in the blank, which gives me the ability to create a new combat group. And I am going to call this our cave entrance. I come up, I click on the add button, and I have now created the cave entrance. So when I click on visible, those 2 orcs, those 2 iceborne orcs that are at the cave entrance are no longer visible on the combat tracker. They are technically still on the combat tracker, which means that their tokens remain visible on the map, but they are just not currently visible in the combat tracker to me. And to bring them back, I just simply make sure I have selected that group. I click visible, and they have appeared back again. So for now, I'm going to make them not visible. And I'm going to come here to my second encounter where we have a warg that's in his own little cave here. Again, I'll add that to our combat tracker. I'm going to hide that out. And I'm just going to move our story here. This little section is our warg cave. So I'm going to make the warg shown. Drag its token into its cave here. I come up to the top, I click on our drop down menu, and I want to left click into this blank space so that I can create a new combat group. And we will call this the warg cave. Like before, I'll come up, I'll click on add. And now if I click the visible button, our warg will no longer be visible on the combat tracker. I can still see the tokens from both combat groups that I've created so far. This really gives the DM that extra visibility into where the NPCs are on the map and how they might interact with each other during gameplay. Opening up our story one more time here, we have our altar room. Again, we'll add them directly to the combat tracker. I will close those out. And I'm going to close our story again. Now, here we have 2 factions that are hostile. And our commoner here, who is our prisoner of these orcs, their faction is friendly. Now, by default, combat groups is not going to add friendly or neutral factions to a combat group. In order to make that happen, we have to use this button up here. So by default, friends is turned off. So we'll see if I create a combat group here. So again, drop down, left click into the blank space, give our combat group a name. We'll call this the altar room. I click on add. And now when I click the visible button to off, our commoner is still visible because by default, they were not added into that combat group. So the reason for that is quite often when we have factions that are friends or neutral, they are traveling with the party all the time. And so we don't want to inadvertently add them into a combat group and make them so that they're not visible. When we do want to do this, we are going to come over, we are going to turn our little friends button on. We are going to hit our add button. And now when you see when I hit visible, our commoner has become a part of that combat group. So I'm going to make one visible, one not. I'm going to take that orc, drop them there. Our hidden orc, I'm just going to put in this little nook here. And our commoner, I'm going to drop down into the corner. Make that no longer visible. Now, on this map, I have 3 encounters. I have our entrance, I have our warg cave, and I have the altar room. They are all technically on the combat tracker. So that means that Fantasy Grounds leaves their tokens in place in the status that we had before. And that means that we now have the ability to make those visible as we need during gameplay. And next, we'll take a look at how we might add or remove NPCs from our existing combat groups. Okay, so we have created our combat groups. We're taking a look at our prep here, and we decide that we might want to add or remove or shift NPCs around between those groups. So let's take a look at how we would do that. First of all, we might make the decision that we want to add another orc into this altar room. So I am going to open up my story. I have my NPC, my Iceborne Orc here, and I'm going to just drag him right onto the combat tracker. Now, in order to add this Iceborne Orc into our altar group, there's a couple of different ways I can approach it. I will have them shown. I'm going to drag them down, drop them on the map here. Now, I can come into my altar room group. I can make it visible. And I can click add in order to add this Iceborne Orc number 5 in. So I click add, come over to visible now, and you will see that that orc disappears. He is now a part of this combat group. Now I may decide, you know what, actually I don't want that orc in the altar. I want to move them out here with my cave entrance group. So what we can do here is we will make our altar room group visible. We'll come down to Iceborne Orc 5, and we're going to click right here on the combat groups icon. And we can see it's telling me that he is currently in the altar room combat group. I hit the drop down, I click on cave entrance, and you'll see that it disappears because it has now been shifted to a different combat group. So I will make this group no longer visible, come here, choose my cave entrance group, make them visible, and we can see Iceborne Orc 5 is now a part of that group. Now, if I have my cave entrance group open, and I think, you know what, I think I do want an extra orc in the altar room, I can open up. I'm going to drag and drop an Iceborne Orc. Number 6 is shown up here, but I don't want it to be a part of this group. I want to add this token back into the altar room. What I can do is come over, click on the combat groups icon, select the altar room, and you'll see it disappears because it has now been added into the altar room. So if I make this cave entrance group no longer visible, I click to my altar room, make them visible, we can see Iceborne Orc has joined that group. So really easy ways to kind of add NPCs to our various groups. Now, what if we want to delete NPCs out of groups? There's a couple of different ways we can go about that. So we'll start here with our, make these guys not visible, and we'll open up our cave entrance and make them visible. So I decide, you know what, actually I don't want Iceborne Orc 5 in this group. As a matter of fact, I'm just not going to add that. So I can right click while hovering over that NPC on the combat tracker. Come here to delete item and confirm deletion. And you can see that token disappears off the map. They have disappeared out of the group. If I make this no longer visible and visible again, that orc is no longer a part of that group. So an easy way there, very similar to how we would delete an NPC off of the combat tracker normally. If I want to get rid of all the NPCs in a particular combat group, I come over here to the delete from combat tracker, and when I click on that, all the NPCs in this shown visible group will disappear. We can see now our cave entrance combat group. There are no NPCs in there. All the tokens have disappeared off the map. And I will just come down here to my cave layer. I'm going to throw them back on the map. Click add. Show both of their tokens. Drag them back onto the map. And we are good. That combat group has been recreated. So those are some ways that you can add, delete, and move NPCs around. One word of caution. If you are used to coming down to menu, coming over here to delete from tracker, and using the delete all non-friendly or delete only foes, it's important to realize if you choose delete all non-friendly, that is going to delete all of the non-friendly NPCs from all of your combat groups. This is telling Fantasy Grounds that any non-friendly NPC that is currently on the combat tracker to delete them, and you don't want that, so don't use this function. Now, if you want to delete an entire combat group from the combat tracker, you would come up here to the top. You're going to click into our field where we add the name of the combat group, and you are going to delete that out and hit enter. You can see immediately our two Iceborne Orcs that were a part of that combat group, our entrance group, they reappear on the combat tracker because they are no longer a part of a combat group that is not visible. If I want to recreate that group, I just simply come up here, I put our cave entrance again, I hit add, and now I can make those not visible. And it's the same tokens, the same NPCs on the combat tracker that I've been dealing with the entire time. Okay, next we're going to get into showing how you can use these combat groups as part of your play. Okay, let's take a look at how you would actually use this during gameplay. So we have our scenario set up. We've got our heroes here at the entrance to the cave. We've got a couple of Iceborne Orcs that are guarding the entrance. We've got our warg up here in our warg cave. And we've got our 3 Iceborne Orcs in the altar room who are guarding our prisoner. So our heroes enter the cave and they engage in combat with our 2 Iceborne Orc. Now, currently, we don't have any of our encounters showing on our combat tracker, any of our combat groups. So I come up, I make sure I've chosen the cave entrance, and I click visible. Now, these 2 orcs that our heroes are fighting with are visible. If we go to our player map, they are visible in the player's combat tracker as well, we can engage in this combat. None of the other combat groups that are hidden, or sorry, not visible right now, are shown on either one of the combat trackers. Coming back to our Dungeon Master screen, let's say that as this combat is occurring, it generates interest from our warg up here. I can come up from our drop down, I can choose the warg cave, and I make the warg visible. The warg comes storming out and is now engaged as part of this combat. Again, looking at the player screen, we can see the players can now see that warg. So they're engaged in their combat. Our heroes defeat the two Iceborne Orc and the warg. So I am going to hide all of those, and I'm going to make them no longer visible on my combat tracker. So first I will make the warg no longer visible, and come here to my cave entrance and make those two orcs no longer visible. Our heroes make their way along and they enter into another combat in the altar room. So now I come up to my combat tracker, I select the altar room combat group, I click visible. Our prisoner, our commoner, and our three orcs appear on the combat tracker. Now this one orc right here, Iceborne Orc number 4, is currently hidden. They are not shown. So if I go to my player map, they can only see the commoner and the two Iceborne Orcs that are currently visible. So that is the way the functionality on the combat tracker would normally work. And continues to work that way. Now there is an option, we'll talk about it here shortly, that you need to make sure is in the right position in order for the players to be able to see the NPCs on their on their combat tracker. And we'll take a look at that next. Now, the Combat Groups extension does have some options that are available, and we'll take a look at those. If we come here, click on our options window, and scroll down towards the bottom here to our Combat Groups options. So there are two options in here that I tend to change. The first is highlight token for old eyes, which is currently magenta. So if we look on our combat tracker, it is Blaze's turn. And if we look over here on the map, Blaze has this magenta square around them to let us know that it is their turn. Now, we are able to change this to off. We can change it to their faction color, a straight orange, a straight green, or back to that magenta. I personally use a different extension for this same function, so I usually turn this one off. The second option that you want to take a look at is here where players only see same faction. So by default, this is turned on. And when it is turned on, if we come to our player screen, you'll notice that although we know there are two orcs that are currently on my combat tracker, because they are a different faction than the players, they only see the commoner. So if I come back, I turn that off, switch back to my player's screen, now they can see the two orcs that they are fighting. So that's an option that you want one way or the other, but it's good to know that's there because your players may be used to seeing the NPCs that they are fighting on their combat tracker, so that they can drag their attacks and their damage directly onto the combat tracker. So that's an important one to know about. So two options there that you might be interested in manipulating: the highlight token for old eyes, players only see same faction. but a bunch of other options there that you may be interested in changing for your personal taste. Okay, that's a wrap for this video. Hopefully you have learned about combat groups, the combat groups extension. Again, fantastic extension, one that I really love to use. If you've enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments. Give the video a thumbs up. If you are a subscriber, thank you very much. If you don't yet subscribe, please consider subscribing. Click that little bell icon so that you'll know each time that I put out a new video. Thanks very much for watching, and happy gaming.